The day Edith Collins walked into the Silver Creek Saloon and ordered a whiskey at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, every woman in Caldwell, Kansas stopped pretending she did not exist and started pretending she was already gone. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat like a dusty thumbprint on the edge of the Kisham Trail, where cattle drives still pushed northward and men with hard eyes and harder hands moved through like weather. The saloon smelled of sawdust and sour mash, and the particular kind of loneliness that settles into places where people come and go without ever truly arriving. Edith sat at the bar with her spine straight and her dark hair pinned loose at the nape of her neck, and she drank that whiskey without flinching, and she ordered another, and nobody said a word to her directly. They just said things around her, the way people do when they want someone to hear but cannot be blamed for saying. She was 27 years old and had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Gerald Collins, had been a respected cattle broker with good boots and a reputation for fair dealing. He had also been a man who liked to drink privately and hurt privately, and had made Edith's life a quiet, sealed-up kind of misery for 6 years. When Gerald died of a fever in late 1877, there had been a brief period of mourning expected of Edith, and she had performed it with the kind of precision of someone who has learned to perform everything. She wore black. She accepted casseroles. She sat in the front pew at the Methodist church and looked appropriately stricken. But then the mourning period ended, and Edith did not become what Caldwell expected her to become, which was a soft and grateful widow who sold the small house on Chestnut Street and moved back to wherever she had come from, or married again quickly and quietly and thanked God for the chance. Instead, Edith kept the house. She planted a kitchen garden. She stopped attending church on the Sundays when Reverend Marsh delivered his particular brand of sermon about the virtue of submission. She bought a horse, a gray mare she named Clover, and she rode out onto the prairie alone, which was something women in Caldwell simply did not do. And then the whiskey. Not that she was a drunkard. She wasn't. But she had decided, sometime in the bleak middle of that first year without Gerald, that she was done shrinking. She was done apologizing for taking up space. She was done being quiet in all the rooms she was supposed to be quiet in. And so she walked into the Silver Creek Saloon on a Tuesday afternoon, and she ordered a whiskey, and she sat there and she was visible. And that was the thing that Caldwell could not forgive. Mrs. Hargrove, who ran the dry goods store and considered herself the moral architecture of the town, had said it plainly to her friend Mrs. Delacroix one evening over tea. "That woman is past saving," she said, stirring her cup with the authority of someone pronouncing sentence. "Past saving and past caring, and there is nothing to be done for her except to let her run herself into the ground. Mrs. Delacroix had nodded with the measured sympathy of someone who agreed completely but wanted to appear charitable. The assessment spread outward from that parlor like water finding level, and by November of 1878, it was simply understood in Caldwell that Edith Collins was a woman who had chosen her own ruin, and the town had collectively decided to stand back and watch. What the town did not account for was Paul Watkins. He rode in on the 3rd of November, 1878, on a bay horse with one white stocking and saddlebags that looked like they had seen every kind of weather. He was 32 years old and had the kind of face that had been shaped by sun and wind and years of looking at things directly without flinching away. He was not a particularly large man, but he carried himself with a steadiness that made him seem substantial, the way old trees do even when they are not the tallest in the stand. He wore a plain brown coat, a gray hat with a sweat-darkened band, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He had a rifle in his scabbard and a Colt on his hip, because this was the Kansas frontier, and a man who rode without either was a man who was not paying attention. He pulled up at the livery stable on Main Street and paid for his horse's board for 3 nights, then walked the length of Caldwell slowly, the way a man does when he is learning a new place, reading its proportions and its temperament. He stopped at the general store for provisions. He got a room at the Caldwell Hotel. He ate supper at the diner on 2nd Street and was pleasant to the girl who brought his food without being the kind of pleasant that made her feel obligated to anything. Then he walked out into the cold November evening and stood on the boardwalk and looked at the sky, which was enormous and full of stars, and he breathed in the smell of the prairie and the coal smoke from the chimneys, and something in his expression was a man arriving somewhere with intention. Paul Watkins had come to Caldwell because a man he had ridden with for 3 seasons on the cattle drives, a fellow named Dutch Hannigan, had told him about a small parcel of land south of town that was selling for a reasonable price and had a creek running through the corner of it. Paul had spent years moving, first as a cowhand on the big drives up from Texas, then as a scout for a surveying outfit, then briefly as a deputy in a town in Colorado that hadn't suited him. He was tired of moving. He wanted land. He wanted a place where the seasons meant something because they were his seasons, his land, his winter and his spring. He was not a man who had given much thought to what else he might want because he had been too busy surviving, but he was beginning to suspect that surviving was not the same as living. He first saw Edith Collins on his 2nd morning in Caldwell. He was coming out of the hotel and she was crossing the street, and the thing that struck him was not that she was beautiful, though she was, in the particular way of women who have stopped trying to seem like something other than what they are. What struck him was the quality of her attention. She was looking at the sky, not in a dreamy, absent way, but with focus, like she was reading something in it, like the sky was a text she was working to understand. The morning light came at a low angle and caught the side of her face, and she had a line between her brows that was not unhappiness but concentration, and Paul stopped walking for a fraction of a second before he continued on, and he thought, involuntarily, there is a person. They did not speak that morning. He went about his business, which involved riding out to look at the land parcel with a man from the land office named Henderson, who talked too much and smelled of bay rum, and had a habit of mentioning his own experience in the cattle trade every 3 minutes. The land was good. The creek was real, a modest thing that ran clean over a bed of pale stones, and Paul stood at its edge for a long time, looking at the way the cottonwood trees grew along the bank, and the way the grass came down to the water and the particular silence of the place, and he decided that he wanted it. He came back to town in the late afternoon and went to the Silver Creek saloon for a beer, because he had been in the cold for hours and beer was what was available and it was that or nothing. He sat at a table near the window and the bartender, a heavy-set man named Cal who had one ear slightly higher than the other, brought him his drink without ceremony. The saloon was quiet at that hour, 2 cowboys at the far end of the bar playing cards with themselves, a man asleep in the corner, and then Edith Collins, sitting 3 stools down from Paul's table at the bar with a glass of whiskey and a small book in her hands. She was reading. In the Silver Creek saloon on a Thursday afternoon, Edith Collins was reading a book. Paul looked at this scene and found that he liked it considerably. He did not stare. He was not the kind of man who stared. He looked at his beer and the window and the street outside, where the wind was pushing a tumbleweed past the barber shop, and he thought about the land and what he would build on it and what order things would need to happen in. But he was aware of her the whole time, in the peripheral and specific way you are aware of the only other fire in a cold room. After about 20 minutes, one of the cowboys from the far end of the bar came down and leaned on the bar near Edith and said something in a low voice that Paul could not hear from where he sat. Whatever it was, Edith did not look up from her book. She turned a page. The cowboy said something else, louder this time, something with a smile in it that was not kind. Edith still did not look up. She reached for her whiskey, took a sip, and set it down with perfect precision, and then she said in a voice clear and flat as a stone dropping into still water, "I am reading. Go away." The cowboy laughed, but it was an uncertain laugh, the kind that comes when a man has been refused by someone who did not even treat the refusal as significant. He went back to his cards. Paul picked up his beer and considered, and then he stood and walked to the bar and sat down 2 stools from Edith, leaving an empty one between them, and he said to Cal, "I'll have another one of these when you get a chance." And Cal brought it, and Paul did not say a single word to Edith Collins. He just sat there, reading the room, minding his own business. After a moment, from behind her book, Edith said, "You are not going to say something presumptuous to me?" "No," Paul said. "Why not?" "Because I do not have anything presumptuous to say," Paul said, "and because it looks like you are at the good part." There was a pause. Then Edith lowered the book slightly and looked at him, and her eyes were brown and direct, and contained within them the specific wariness of someone who has learned that, when things seem uncomplicated, they are usually waiting to become complicated. "It is the good part," she said. "I will not interrupt it," Paul said. She studied him for another moment, in the way that Edith Collins had of looking at people as though she were checking the arithmetic of them. And then she raised the book again, and he went back to his beer. And they sat there in a silence that was, remarkably, not uncomfortable, and the afternoon turned orange in the windows, and the saloon gradually filled with the coming in of evening. Before she left, Edith closed her book and said, without looking at him, "You are new in town." "3 days," Paul said. "What brings you to Caldwell?" "Land," he said. "There is a parcel south of town I am looking to purchase." She considered this. "Henderson at the land office will try to charge you more than it is worth," she said. "The asking price has been sitting there for 8 months because he set it too high. Go back at the end of the month. He will be anxious to meet his quarterly numbers, and you will get it for 15% less." Paul looked at her then properly, and she was already standing with her book under her arm and coins on the bar, and her expression was not the expression of someone who had just done something kind. It was the expression of someone stating a mathematical fact. "Much obliged," Paul said. She walked out without replying, and Paul sat with his beer and felt the particular sensation of finding something you had not known you were looking for. The talk about Edith Collins reached him in pieces over the following days, the way talk in small towns always does, arriving in fragments from different directions, until you have assembled an unwanted portrait of someone from other people's opinions. Cal the bartender mentioned her in passing. Henderson at the land office made a tight-lipped reference to her unconventional ways. The woman at the laundry where Paul dropped off shirts said something disapproving about Edith and the saloon that Paul did not engage with. The man who ran the livery stable was more direct. "That Collins woman is trouble," he said. "Been trouble since her husband died. You would do well to keep your distance." Paul had nodded pleasantly and given the man no indication of his thoughts, which were that trouble was a word people applied to women who did not do what they were told, and that he had known enough actual trouble in his life to know the difference. He went back to the land office at the end of November. Henderson, who had indeed been anxious about his quarterly figures, came down 14% on the price after 20 minutes of negotiation, and Paul Watkins signed papers on 37 acres south of Caldwell with a creek in the corner, and became, for the first time in his life, a man with land. He celebrated this fact alone, standing at the creek in the cold dusk, listening to the water move under a shelf of thin ice at the edges, and he felt something settle in him like a stone finding its place at the bottom of that creek bed. He was here. He was staying. Now he had to build. He went to work with the focus and economy of a man who has built things before and knows that the first winter is the hardest. He hired 2 young men from town, brothers named Cole and Amos Ferris, who were strong and willing and did not talk excessively, and they framed a cabin in 2 weeks and had a roof on it before the serious cold set in. It was a small cabin, 1 room, with a stone fireplace that Paul built himself after studying the technique from a book he had carried in his saddlebags for 2 years. He got a wood stove. He got a proper bed frame. He laid the wood floor himself, plank by plank, and when it was done he stood in it, and it was plain and cold and smelled of fresh timber, and it was entirely and completely his, and he was happy. In the weeks that followed, He came into Caldwell regularly for supplies, and he saw Edith Collins in the way you see someone in a town of a certain size, across the street, outside the general store, at the far end of the post office line. Each time there was a brief exchange of acknowledgement, a nod, sometimes a few words. She was not warm in the way of women who have been told to be warm, but she was genuine in a way that Paul found more nourishing than warmth. When she said something, she meant it. When she did not want to talk, she did not pretend she did. One cold afternoon in early December, he found her outside the hardware store trying to manage a broken wheel on a small hand cart she had loaded with bags of feed grain for her chickens. The wheel had cracked at the rim, and the whole thing was listing badly. Two men had walked past her without stopping. Paul came around the corner, assessed the situation, and crouched down beside the wheel. "I can fix this," he said, "if you have got a spare 10 minutes. Edith looked at him with that checking arithmetic expression. "I do not have a spare anything," she said. "But yes." He took the wheel off, found a piece of iron banding at the hardware store and the tools to shape it, and repaired the rim in about 15 minutes while Edith held the cart steady and did not fill the silence with unnecessary noise. When it was done and the wheel was back on and the cart rolled properly, she tested it back and forth with a critical eye, and then she said, "You are good with your hands." "I have had to be," Paul said. "What did you do before you decided to plant yourself on 37 acres outside Caldwell?" Paul was surprised she knew the specific acreage. He showed it on his face and she said without apology, "Henderson talks. Also it is a small town, I pay attention." "Cattle drives mostly," Paul said. "Some scouting, a spell as a deputy in Colorado." "Why did you leave the deputy work?" He thought about this for a moment. "It did not suit me," he said. "Being the one who decided what counted as enough trouble to act on, I did not always agree with the counting." Edith was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I understand that entirely." And something in the way she said it made Paul think that she was not speaking abstractly, that there was a whole landscape of understanding behind those words that he did not yet have the map to, and he wanted the map. "Would you let me buy you a cup of coffee?" he asked. "At the diner. It is cold and you have been standing out here for 20 minutes. Edith looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled her coat tighter and said, "Coffee. Yes." They sat in the diner on 2nd Street, and they talked for an hour and a half. And it was the kind of conversation that feels like it is about ordinary things while actually being about everything. Paul told her about growing up in Missouri and coming west at 19 on the first cattle drive he could sign onto. He told her about the plains in Texas and what the sky looked like at night when you were 3 days from anything, and the stars were so thick you could not find the dark between them. He told her about the surveying work and the things he had learned about the land and the way water moved through it, and what the shape of a hillside could tell you about what happened in a hard rain. He told her about the land he had bought, not in the proud way of property ownership, but in the intimate way of someone who has found something and wants to describe why it matters to them. Edith listened with her whole attention. She asked questions that were precise and showed she had actually heard what he said, not the performance of listening but the real thing. And when she spoke about herself, she was careful but not closed. She told him she had come to Caldwell from Tennessee as a young woman, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had believed in her education even when it was unusual for girls to have one. She told him about reading. She loved to read with a seriousness and enthusiasm that was a little breathtaking, as though books were not entertainment but oxygen. And she talked about her kitchen garden and her chickens and the gray mare Clover with a specificity and affection that told Paul these things were not hobbies but the building blocks of a life she was constructing deliberately, brick by brick, in the space opened up by Gerald Collins's death. She did not talk about Gerald. Paul did not ask. When they stood to leave and she pulled on her gloves outside the diner in the cold afternoon air, she said, "I am told I am past saving." Her voice was level. She was looking at the street. Paul thought about this. He pulled on his own gloves and settled his hat. "I have not come to save you," he said. I have come to Caldwell to plant 100 acres and build something worth keeping." She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite hope but was in the same territory as hope, something guarded and real and almost frightened by itself. "You are a strange man, Paul Watkins," she said. "I have been called worse," he said. She almost smiled. He saw it form at the corner of her mouth and then reconsider and stop. And he thought that he would very much like to see that smile complete itself one day. December moved through the town like a quiet relative, bringing cold and early dark and the particular stillness of the plains in winter. Paul worked on his land, digging post holes for a proper fence line that would keep cattle out of his crops come spring, laying in firewood, learning the specific habits of his creek and his 37 acres. He came into town twice a week for supplies and other necessities, and he looked for Edith without meaning to, the way your eyes find the brightest thing in a room without consulting you first. He saw the way the town treated her. He saw it with the clarity of someone who is new enough to a place to not have absorbed its particular blindnesses. He watched women cross the street to avoid passing her on the boardwalk. He watched Mrs. Hargrove's expression in the general store when Edith came in, the way she attended to other customers with exaggerated attentiveness. He watched the men at the saloon, how some of them looked at Edith with the considering look of men who believed that a woman who drank in a saloon was a woman who had forfeited the right to be treated with respect. He watched all of this and felt a slow, deep anger that he was careful not to perform, because performing anger was about the performer and not about the subject, and this was about Edith. He did not tell her what he saw. She knew. She had been living in it for 14 months. What he did was come by on a Tuesday morning with a bag of coffee beans he had picked up at the general store and knock at the door of the small house on Chestnut Street. When Edith answered, she was in her working clothes, a plain brown dress with an apron over it, her hair back in a practical braid, and she had flour on her left cheekbone. "I found these at the store," Paul said, holding out the bag. "I remember you said you liked the dark roast." She had mentioned it once in passing at the diner. She stood at the door and looked at him and looked at the bag and said, "You remembered that." "I have a good memory," Paul said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in then. I have biscuits in the oven." The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and baking, and something underneath that was the smell of books and dried herbs, and every surface was orderly and considered, the shelves of books arranged with care, the kitchen garden herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling, a pair of good boots by the door standing precisely parallel. It was the house of someone who had made deliberate choices about what to keep and what to put away, and Paul felt the hospitality of it like warmth on the face after cold. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and hot biscuits and talked while the winter light came through the window, and outside Clover moved slowly in the small paddock at the back of the property, and the chickens made their low, steady conversation in their yard, and the morning went on pleasantly and without any particular urgency. Edith told him about the book she was currently reading, which was a collection of essays by a botanist who had traveled the Western Territories documenting plant species, and she described the plants with such genuine enthusiasm that Paul found himself wanting to know all their names. He asked questions and she answered them, and she had the particular delight of someone who rarely gets to talk about the things they love most, and Paul thought that this was one of the more criminal things about Edith Collins' situation in Caldwell, that she had all this richness inside her and was surrounded by people who had decided not to see it. "Do you miss it?" Edith asked him suddenly when there was a comfortable gap in the conversation. "Moving, the drives, traveling." Paul thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I miss the scale of it," he said. "The sky when you are 3 weeks out and there is nothing between you and the horizon, but I do not miss the rootlessness." "I was very tired of not belonging anywhere." Edith looked at her coffee cup. "I have lived in Caldwell for 8 years," she said quietly, "and I have never quite belonged here either." "You belong to your garden," Paul said, "and your horses and your books. That is a different kind of belonging, but it is real." She looked up at him then, and there was that edge of not quite hope again, closer this time, and also something a little raw, the look of someone who has been told for a long time what they are not, and is surprised to be told what they might be. "You see things very clearly," she said. "I try to see things as they are," Paul said. "Not as it would be more convenient for them to be." They were quiet for a moment, and then Edith said, "Most people in this town have decided I am a problem to be managed or a lesson to be warned by. You are the first person in a very long time who has just sat at my table and talked to me like I am a person." "You are the most interesting person in Caldwell," Paul said, simply, as though he were reporting a fact he had verified. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. It was a silence with something new in it, something warm and tentative and electric all at once, and Edith looked at him across the table with her brown eyes and the flower still on her cheekbone, and Paul did not move or speak because he did not want to frighten whatever this was away. Then a log shifted in the fireplace, and Edith blinked and looked at her biscuit and said, "There is butter in the crock," and Paul said, "Thank you," and they went on. January came in severe, as Kansas Januaries do, with wind that had traveled uninterrupted across 800 miles of flat land, before arriving at Caldwell with nothing to show for the trip except a bad temper. Paul's cabin held well, the stone fireplace was good, but the cold was genuine, and the work of keeping 37 acres functional in a plains winter was considerable. He broke ice on the creek every morning for his horses' water. He kept the wood stores built up. He worked on his plans for spring, rough drawings of where the crops would go, which fields he would put in sod corn and which in wheat, where he would build a proper barn when the money was there. He came into town when he could, and the visits to Edith's house on Chestnut Street became a regular thing, twice a week if the weather allowed, sometimes 3 times. They fell into an easy rhythm coffee in her kitchen on the cold mornings, occasional evenings playing cards at the kitchen table with a worn deck she had owned since Tennessee, long conversations that ranged from botany to the state of Kansas politics, to the mechanics of well digging, to whatever novel she was currently working through. She lent him books, pressing them into his hands with the specific urgency of someone who needs you to understand why this particular thing matters, and Paul read them carefully and came back with real responses, and her pleasure at this was visible and unconstrained, a flash of the person she might be when she was not braced for the world's opinion. He also spent time watching Caldwell come to terms with the fact that Paul Watkins, who was respectable by any measure, worked his land, paid his debts, caused no trouble, was clearly choosing to spend considerable time with Edith Collins. This produced a particular social weather in town. Mrs. Hargrove expressed concern to whoever would receive it. Cal at the saloon raised an eyebrow and kept his own counsel. Henderson at the land office tried an oblique warning that Paul received politely and disregarded entirely. The person who said something direct was Reverend Marsh, who caught Paul outside the general store one morning in mid-January and said, with the air of a man who believes he is being helpful, "I hear you have been spending time with the Collins widow." "I have," Paul said. Reverend Marsh paused, having expected this to be deniable. He regrouped. "She is not a woman of good standing in this community," he said carefully. "A man of your qualities could find better company." Paul looked at the Reverend for a moment, measuring something. Then he said, pleasantly and without heat, "I think Edith Collins is a woman of extraordinary character who has been treated poorly by people who should know better, and I intend to continue having coffee in her kitchen as often as she will have me. Good morning, Reverend." He walked away and did not look back, and whatever the Reverend did with his expression was his own business. He told Edith about it that afternoon, and she went very still for a moment, and then she laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh properly, a real laugh that took up space and did not apologize for itself, and it changed her face completely, and Paul thought that if he could spend the rest of his life making that happen, he would consider himself successful. "You should not make enemies on my account," she said, when the laugh subsided. "I was not making an enemy," Paul said. I was just telling the truth. It seems in short supply around here." Edith looked at him, and the not-quite-hope was moving closer to its destination, and she said quietly, "You are not afraid of what they say about you." "I am 32 years old," Paul said. "I have ridden drives up from Texas in weather that would embarrass November. I have been shot at once in Colorado, and I did not die. The opinions of Mrs. Hargrove and Reverend Marsh are less alarming than any of those things." Edith stood by the window with her coffee cup, looking at the street, where the cold light was flat and silver, and the cottonwood trees were bare sticks against the sky. "I used to care enormously what they thought," she said, "when I first came here with Gerald. I wanted so badly to belong. I brought casseroles to newcomers, and I sang in the church choir, and I wore my hair exactly as it ought to be worn." She stopped. "And then I understood that the belonging was conditional, that there were things I was allowed to be and things I was not, and the list of things I was not kept growing, and eventually I realized that the belonging they were offering was not belonging at all. It was performance, and I was very tired of performing." Paul came and stood beside her at the window, not close enough to press anything but present. "You do not have to perform anything here," he said. She turned and looked at him, and their faces were close in the winter light, and she said softly, "I know." The word was simple and enormous and true, and Paul felt it somewhere central. He did not move. She did not move. Outside, the cold street went about its business, and inside the small house on Chestnut Street there was the sound of the fire and the chickens in their yard and the specific silence of two people standing at the edge of something and recognizing it. It was Edith who stepped back. Not in fear, but in her characteristic deliberateness. She took one step back and looked at him steadily and said, "I need you to understand something about me." "Tell me," Paul said. "I am not a woman who will be saved," she said. "I have heard that word my entire life. Saved, as if I am a ship going down and someone needs to throw me a rope. I am not going down, I am building something, slowly and on my own terms, and I do not need a rescuer." "I know," Paul said. "I am not here to rescue you." "Then what are you here for?" He held her gaze. "I am here because this is where I want to be," he said. "I am here because 37 acres and a creek and a half-built barn are insufficient company. I am here because you are the only person I have met in a decade who talks to me like there is something worth hearing in return." He paused. "I am not here to save you, Edith. I am here to stay beside you if you will have me." The silence after that was like the moment after a bell rings, when the sound is gone but the air still carries the shape of it. Edith's expression moved through several things he could not quite name, and then settled into something that was clear and open and a little terrifying in its honesty. "That is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in years," she said. Paul smiled, and it was a slow, warm smile that started in his eyes. "I am a sensible man." "You are a remarkable man," Edith said quietly, and then she turned back to the window, and her shoulders had lost some of the particular tension they usually carried, and they stood together in the winter light and looked at the cold street, and it was good. February in Caldwell was a siege. The wind did not stop. The temperature dropped to places that made the water in Paul's cabin freeze in the bucket overnight, and he spent 2 weeks unable to do much beyond keep his animals alive, and his fire going and work through the stack of books Edith had given him. He read a history of the Oregon Trail that made him thoughtful about the people who had come before and what they had given to get here. He read a novel that Edith had pressed into his hands with particular emphasis, saying only, "Tell me what you think of the ending." And when he got to the ending, he sat with it for a long time because it was complicated and right in the way that complicated things sometimes are. He got to town on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February, the first clear day in 2 weeks, and went straight to Chestnut Street. Edith answered the door looking not quite like herself. Her color was off and her eyes were too bright, and when she said, "Come in," her voice was slightly ragged. "Are you ill?" Paul said. "I am fine," Edith said, which was so obviously untrue that Paul looked at her with the direct and patient expression he had for things that were not true. "You are not fine," he said. She sat down at the kitchen table a little heavily. "It is just a cold," she said. "I have had it for 4 days. It is improving." He looked at her kitchen and saw the evidence of someone who had been managing alone for 4 days with a significant cold. Unwashed cups, a pot on the stove with something in it that had been there too long, no fire laid in the front room. He took off his coat and hat and hung them on the peg by the door. "What are you doing?" Edith said. "Laying a fire," Paul said, "and then making soup if you have the ingredients, which I suspect you do because I have never seen your larder anything less than organized." "Paul," she began. "Edith," he said gently and firmly, "you are sick and you have been managing alone for 4 days, and there is no shame in letting someone bring you soup. It is just soup." She watched him kneel at the fireplace and begin laying the wood, and after a moment she said, quietly, "All right." He made soup from what was in the larder, which was well organized as predicted, dried beans and salt pork and onions, and the last of the winter carrots from the root cellar, and he had it going within an hour. He kept the fire built up and the cabin warm, and Edith sat at the table wrapped in a shawl reading, or trying to read. She had a way of watching him when she thought he was not looking, a private and slightly wondering look, as though she was testing the reality of what she was seeing against what she had learned to expect. When the soup was ready, he served it and she ate 2 full bowls, which he took as a good sign, and then she sat back and said, "You did not have to do this." "I know," Paul said. "You rode all the way from your land in the cold." "I did." She looked at him across the table. "Why?" "Because I have not seen you in 2 weeks and I was concerned," he said simply. The look she gave him then was the most unguarded thing he had seen from her yet. It lasted only a moment, a flash of something that was relief and recognition, and a kind of tenderness she had not quite known what to do with. Then she looked at her soup bowl and said, "You should stay for dinner. The roads will be icy before long." "I was planning to," Paul said, and she almost smiled. He stayed through dinner and they played cards at the kitchen table, and Edith beat him comprehensively at 3 games of cribbage, which she did with quiet satisfaction while he accused the cards of being treacherous. By the evening she had more color in her face and her eyes were sharper, and when he finally said he needed to head back, she stood at the door with her shawl around her shoulders and said, "Paul." He turned. "Thank you," she said. It was 2 words, but she meant approximately 40 words by them, and he understood all 40. "I will come Thursday," he said. "I will make coffee," she said. He rode home through the icy dark feeling something he had not felt in a very long time, which was that the world was arranged in a way that made sense. March came in with mud and tentative warmth, and the sense of the land stirring under its winter weight. Paul turned his attention to the spring planting with fierce concentration, because the first year's crops were everything. They were the foundation of whether this land would sustain him or not. He was up before light and in the fields until dark, the work of plowing and harrowing, and the careful calculation of where to put what. Cole and Amos Ferris came back to work for wages, and together they laid out the corn on the east field and began the preparation for wheat on the flatter ground near the road. He still came into town twice a week. He still went to Chestnut Street. But the conversation between them had shifted since February, since the soup and the fire and the 2 words at the door, and the shift was subtle but real. There was less guarding. There was more of the thing that was underneath the guarding, which was that they were both, quietly and with growing certainty, in the process of falling for each other. It happened in the specific way it happens for people who have had reason to be careful, not like a sudden drop, but like a slow tide coming in, each wave a little higher than the last, so that one day you look down and you are standing in it up to your waist, and the surprise is only that it feels so right and not frightening at all. He noticed her hands. Not in a dramatic way, just repeatedly, her capable, precise hands as she shaped biscuits or turned pages, or held the reins of clover or dealt cards at the kitchen table. He noticed the way she held her coffee cup with both hands when it was very cold. He noticed the specific sound of her voice when she was talking about something she loved, a brightness that came into it, half a note higher than her usual register. He noticed the way she listened fully, actively, like your words mattered and she was going to do something with them. Edith, for her part, was having her own private reckoning. She was 30 years old now, having turned 28 before Christmas, and she was not naive about what she felt. She had loved before, or thought she had, the confident and consuming certainty of a young woman who had married Gerald Collins, believing she understood what love was and learning otherwise. She was not going to be careless with what she felt now, but she was also, for the first time in a long time, not afraid of it. Paul Watkins was not Gerald Collins. This was not a small observation. It was the central fact of everything. Gerald had been charming in company and cold at home, a man whose warmth was performed for audiences and withheld from the one person who needed it most. Paul was quiet in company and warm in private, easy and present and genuinely interested in the particular reality of Edith Collins, not the version of her he would prefer her to be. He said what he meant. He did what he said. He showed up, with coffee beans and repaired wheels and soup and books he had actually read, and he showed up with a consistency that Edith had learned to trust only slowly, because she had learned that trust was a debt instrument and she had been bankrupted before. One evening in late March, they sat on the front porch of the house on Chestnut Street in the mild spring dark, drinking coffee that had gone slightly cold, and Edith said, "Tell me about the worst thing that has happened to you." Paul was quiet for a moment and she respected the pause. Then he said, "I had a partner once when I was scouting, a man named Eli. We worked together for 2 years. He was good at everything: reading land, finding water, moving quiet. We trusted each other the way you do when your life has depended on someone long enough." He stopped. "He died in a rockslide in the Colorado mountains, stupid and sudden and no meaning to it. I had to bring his horse and his gear back to a town in Colorado where his sister lived, and I had to tell her." He was quiet again. "I have never felt more useless in my life than I did at that door." Edith looked at him in the dim light. "How did you come back from that?" "Slowly," Paul said. "And not all the way, not for a long time. I think grief works like that. It does not go away, it just gets more familiar. You learn where it lives in you and you accommodate it." Edith nodded, looking at the dark street. "Gerald was not kind," she said, after a pause. "I have never said that plainly to anyone. He was not kind and I was very alone in that marriage, and I am not sad that he died. I am only sad that I was there to begin with, and that I was not more than the things he was willing to let me be." Paul did not rush to fill this with comfort because Edith did not want comfort. She wanted witness, and he gave her that. He sat with it quietly and then he said, "You have made yourself more in spite of all of it. That is visible in everything you do." "Some days it does not feel like enough," she said. "That is how it feels when you are still building," Paul said. "You cannot judge the building from the middle." She looked at him sideways and said, "That is either very wise or something you made up just now." "Both," Paul said, and she laughed, the real laugh, the one that took up space, and in the spring dark it was the best sound in the world. He reached over and took her hand. It was not dramatic. It was not preceded by a declaration. He just reached over on the porch in the mild March dark and took her hand, and Edith looked down at their joined hands and then looked at him, and her expression was clear and open, and something precious was in it, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand slightly and wove her fingers through his. They sat like that until the coffee was cold and the stars were fully out above Caldwell, and the frogs had started up in the ditch along the road, and the spring night was all around them, and everything was said in the silence without any of it needing to be spoken aloud. April came and the crops came in with the April rain. Neat rows of green pushing up from the turned earth on Paul's 37 acres, and he walked his fields in the morning, watching the progress of things with the private intensity of someone who has decided to put his life into the land, and is watching the land respond. The creek ran high with spring melt and sparkled under the cottonwoods that were leafing out now in pale sharp green, and the prairie around his property was coming into its season. the grasses long and moving in the wind and the wildflowers coming up in the low spots. He brought Edith out to see it one Sunday in mid-April, riding side by side on Clover and his bay horse, and she was quiet the entire way, looking at everything with her particular quality of attention. When they got to the land, she rode slowly along the creek bank, and then stopped and looked at the fields and the cabin and the half-built barn, and the whole 37 acres laid out under the spring sky. "It is beautiful," she said. Paul, beside her, looked at his land with her looking at it, and felt the specific richness of showing something you love to someone you love. "It is getting there," he said. She turned in the saddle to face him, and her dark hair was loose today, which was unusual, and the April wind moved it, and she put one hand up to catch it and looked at him with the wild kind of directness that she had when she was feeling something and had decided not to manage it. "Paul," she said. "Yes," he said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." She looked at him steadily. "I have not been happy since I was 23, she said. 14 months of being a widow, and 2 months before that of watching Gerald die, and 6 years before that of a marriage that was everything a marriage should not be. I have been managing, surviving, building, as you said." She paused. "And then you came and sat 2 stools away from me in the Silver Creek saloon and did not say a single presumptuous word, and something happened that I cannot explain more precisely than to say I have been happy since. Simply, ordinarily, specifically happy. And I needed you to know that." Paul sat on his horse in the April wind and felt this go through him like light going through water, refracted and everywhere. He looked at Edith Collins, the most interesting person in Caldwell, with her loose dark hair and her direct eyes and her extraordinary mind and the hard-won genuine happiness she had just given him the gift of naming. "I love you," he said, simply, directly, because it was true and had been true for some time, and it was the exact right moment to say so. Edith's expression did something swift and complicated that ended in clarity. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying to be careful about it, and I find I cannot be careful about it anymore." He reached across the space between the horses, and she reached back, and they held hands in the April wind over 37 acres of planted land with the creek running in the corner. And it was not a fairy tale. They were both too old and too honest for fairy tales. But it was real and warm and entirely true, and it was better than a fairy tale because of that. He asked her to marry him in May, at her kitchen table, over coffee, and the remains of a pie she had made from the first rhubarb of the season. He did not make a production of it. He said, "I want to build a house on the land that is big enough for both of us, and a kitchen garden twice the size of this one, and bookshelves on every wall. I want to marry you, Edith, not to save you from anything, because I would like to spend my life beside you." Edith looked at him across the table, and her eyes were bright, and she was not performing anything, not restraint, not caution, not the measured composure she had worn as armor for years. She was just Edith, at her own kitchen table in the May morning, and she said, "Yes." They were married in June 1879, not at the Methodist Church, because Edith declined to be married by Reverend Marsh, but outside, on Paul's land, by a circuit judge who came through Caldwell on the second Tuesday of the month. Cole and Amos Ferris stood as witnesses. Cal the bartender came because he had quietly decided Paul Watkins was decent people. Dutch Hannigan, who had told Paul about the land in the first place, rode up from Wichita and stood there with his hat in his hands, looking genuinely moved. A small handful of Caldwell's population came, not the Mrs. Hargroves of the town, but the ones who had watched the last 6 months and drawn their own conclusions. The woman from the laundry who had spoken disapprovingly, and then changed her mind when she watched Paul carry 3 loads of firewood to Chestnut Street on a February morning. The librarian who had been lending Edith books for years and understood what kind of woman she was, the doctor and his wife. It was a clear day in early June with a sky so blue it seemed operatic, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf, and the corn was knee-high in the east field, and Edith wore a dress the color of prairie sage and her hair up in the way she wore it when she had decided something was important. And she was more beautiful than anything Paul had seen in 32 years of looking at the world. They stood in the June grass beside the creek and said what they meant, and Judge Abernethy said the words and it was done, and Paul kissed her once properly, and Dutch Hannigan said something complimentary that was slightly too loud and everyone laughed. The reception, such as it was, happened on the land, with a trestle table and food that Edith and the librarian's wife had prepared together, and there was lemonade and a jug of something stronger that Dutch had contributed, and the afternoon went long and easy and full of the best kind of company, people who actually knew them. When everyone had gone in the late afternoon and the land was quiet again, and the creek made its steady small sound in the cottonwoods, Paul and Edith stood together on the porch of the cabin looking at the June evening, and Edith leaned her head against his shoulder, and Paul's arm went around her, and they stood there in the particular peace of two people who have found the right thing. "I am going to need much more room for books," Edith said. "I am building bookshelves on every wall," Paul said. She tilted her head up and looked at him. "You meant that. I always mean what I say." She smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that completed itself entirely, the one that had first formed at the corner of her mouth and reconsidered on a November afternoon, and had been making up for lost time ever since. And Paul looked at it, and thought that it was the best thing he had ever seen. They stayed in the cabin that summer while Paul worked on the new house, a proper house with 2 rooms and a loft and a covered porch and the promised bookshelves. Edith moved her belongings from Chestnut Street, her books, her herbs, her good cast-iron pans, her worn card deck, the gray mare Clover who went into the paddock alongside Paul's bay horse and immediately assumed authority over the situation, and the cabin became theirs in the specific way places become yours when you live in them together, accumulating the small evidence of shared life. She kept her garden. On the new land she planted it larger, with the room she had always wanted, proper rows of everything practical and a separate patch that was purely for interest, unusual varieties, plants she had read about and always wanted to try. She kept her chickens, a larger flock now that there was more space. She kept reading, and Paul kept reading the books she pressed on him, and their evenings were often spent each with a book on opposite sides of the fireplace, the fire crackling and the wind outside doing whatever the plains wind did, and this silence was the most contented silence that either of them had known. Paul's crops came in well that first summer. Not spectacularly, farming never performed spectacularly in its first year. There was too much adjustment, too much learning the land's specific temperament, but well enough to be encouraging, well enough to suggest that this was going to work. He began the real barn in August, with Dutch Hannigan down for a week to help, and by September it was standing solid, and the satisfaction of it was enormous and private, and he shared it primarily with Edith, who stood in the barn door with her arms crossed and said, "It is a good barn," with the tone of someone who does not hand out compliments without meaning them, and Paul felt this as the highest possible praise. Autumn came back around, and Caldwell moved into its second year of being the town where Paul Watkins had decided to stay, and the town had gradually, in the way of small communities that dislike being proven wrong, adjusted its understanding of Edith Collins. It could not be called redemption. Exactly, some of the Mrs. Hargroves never relented, but the majority of Caldwell had looked at the situation for a year, and had observed that Edith Collins had married a good, hard-working man who plainly adored her, and that she was running a productive household and a fine piece of land, and that whatever she had been said to be, the evidence of the present was less lurid and more dignified than the story had required. People who had crossed the street now acknowledged her. The Reverend, for his part, said hello without making it a theological statement. Edith noticed this and mentioned it to Paul on an October evening with a wry and somewhat sardonic expression. "They are revising me," she said. "Let them," Paul said. Their revision does not change what the original text says. She laughed. That is an extremely literary way to put it for a man whose preferred reading is land management manuals. I read your books, Paul said with dignity. They are apparently having an effect. She threw a dish towel at him and he caught it, grinning, and she was laughing. And the October firelight was warm in the room, and the evening was good. In November of 1879, exactly 1 year after Paul Watkins had ridden into Caldwell on a bay horse with one white stocking, Edith told him that she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast, over coffee, quietly and directly, which was how Edith told people everything that mattered. She had known for 3 weeks and had spent that time with the information before she was ready to share it, which was characteristic, and Paul had come to understand it. She looked at him across the table with her hands around her coffee cup and her expression careful, not with fear but with the weight of something large. Paul set down his cup and looked at her and felt the size of what she had said expand through the room and through the morning and through every future morning in every possible direction. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked up at her, and his eyes were bright and his voice was quiet when he said, "Are you all right?" "I am extraordinarily all right," she said, and her voice caught slightly on the last word in a way he had never heard from her before. He wrapped both arms around her from where he was crouching and held on, and she put her arms around him and her head against his, and they stayed like that in the November morning with the fire going and the prairie outside the window going white and gold in the autumn light. "We will need the loft finished properly," Edith said, after a moment, into his shoulder. "I will start next week," Paul said, "and I will need more of those botanical reference books, the ones about medicinal plants. I will write to the bookseller in Wichita." She pulled back slightly and looked at his face, which was doing something unguarded and open, all the steadiness still there but shining through it something enormous and uncontained. "You are very happy," she said. "I am more than happy," Paul said. "I do not have the exact word." "Neither do I," Edith said, "but I think we mean the same thing." The winter of 1879 into 1880 was gentler than the previous one, though Kansas never entirely dropped its grievances against warmth. The house was finished by December. Not the loft, which Paul was refining, but the main structure, with its 2 rooms and the porch and the kitchen that was twice the size of Edith's kitchen on Chestnut Street, and the bookshelves, which were on every available wall and already filling up. They moved in at the start of December, and Edith went through every room placing her things with the focused attention of someone who understands that a house becomes a home through the specific weight and position of what you choose to keep in it. The books went up on the shelves. The herbs dried in the kitchen. The good cast-iron pans found their places. A rocking chair that had been her mother's and had made the journey from Tennessee through 6 years of Gerald Collins's house and 14 months of widowhood arrived in the front room beside the fireplace. And Edith sat in it the first evening and looked at the fire and the books and the warm light. And she was crying, quietly, without drama, just the honest overflow of something that had been waiting a long time for a place. Paul sat beside her on the floor because the second chair had not arrived yet, his back against her chair, and did not say anything, just was there. And she put her hand on the top of his head, and they sat in the new house in the December firelight, and the winter was gentle outside and everything was theirs. The baby arrived in July of 1880, a boy, which Paul had not dared hope for specifically because it seemed like hoping for too much at once. He was named Thomas, after Paul's father, who had died when Paul was 14, and he was healthy and loud, and from the first evening in the world seemed to have opinions about things. Edith held him with the focused, total attention she brought to everything important, looking at this new person with the expression of someone reading a profound text, and Paul sat beside her and looked at both of them, and the size of his happiness was not the kind of thing that could be expressed in words. It was the kind of thing you carried in your chest and knew was there by its weight. Thomas grew in the way of babies on the Kansas frontier. in the particular richness of a home where everything had been chosen with intention, where books were everywhere, and the garden was abundant, and the land worked honestly, and the evenings were spent in conversation. He was crawling by autumn and pulling himself upright on the furniture by winter, and by the following spring he was walking in the lurching, determined way of a child who has decided to get somewhere and is working out the mechanics as he goes. Edith taught herself, in the years that followed, to keep teaching herself, which was what she had always done. She made her kitchen garden the best in the county, and people started asking her advice on growing things, and she gave it freely and specifically and without condescension, which was how she gave everything. Paul's farm expanded in careful increments: a second field, a better tool shed, a second horse. The barn was good. Crops were reliable. They were not wealthy, but they were secure, which on the Kansas plains in 1880 was a kind of wealth. The town of Caldwell continued its slow revision of Edith Collins, and she continued to pay this approximately no attention, because she had decided when she was 27 years old and sitting at the bar of the Silver Creek saloon with a whiskey and a book that she was done managing other people's comfort, and she had not returned to that old habit. She was not unfriendly. She was not antagonistic. She was simply and entirely herself, which was what she had always been at her core and had spent years being persuaded to suppress. People who could not accept that were welcome to their opinions. The ones who could accept it, and there were more of them than there had been, got Edith Collins, which was, as Paul would have told anyone who asked, the best thing available in the territory. Mrs. Hargrove, for her part, never revised her assessment. She maintained it until the end of her life with the conviction of someone whose identity has become entangled with a position they cannot abandon without losing themselves. Edith bore this without rancor. "She is a sad woman," she said to Paul once, speaking of Mrs. Hargrove. "I think she has believed for so long that maintaining the standards is the same thing as living that she has forgotten they are different." Paul thought about this. "That is generous." "It is practical," Edith said. "Carrying resentment is heavy. I have enough to carry." He looked at her across the breakfast table and loved her so specifically and thoroughly that the feeling was almost structural, like something you could build on. "You are a better person than they deserve," he said. "I am not better," Edith said. "I am just tired of being small." The second child came in the spring of 1882, a girl they named Clara, who from the first week of her life was visibly different from Thomas. Where Thomas was loud and headlong and certain, Clara was watchful and precise, with her mother's quality of attention and her father's steadiness. Thomas was 3 years old and very interested in Clara, and very interested in making his interest known at volume. The household adjusted with the organized chaos of a family in genuine operation, and Edith navigated it with the competent attention she brought to everything, while also maintaining that she was a person, and not only a mother, which was a distinction she held firmly and which Paul actively supported, because he had married Edith Collins, the full and complete person, and he intended to go on being married to her. He took Thomas with him to the fields on the mornings when the work was manageable for a child's presence, and Thomas stumped along in small boots that were always immediately muddy, asking questions at a rate that Paul answered honestly and thoroughly, because he had noticed that people who talked down to children got children who talked down to people, and he did not want that. Thomas asked where rain came from, and Paul told him about clouds and moisture and the way the air worked. And Thomas asked why the corn grew in rows, and Paul explained about light and water access and root space. And Thomas absorbed all of it with the focus that children bring to things that have been explained to them with respect. Clara, when she was old enough to be fascinated by things, was fascinated by her mother's books. She would sit in Edith's lap at the kitchen table and look at the pictures in the botanical reference volumes, with an attention that suggested she was already doing something serious with what she was seeing. Edith was patient and complete in her explanations and never condescended, and Clara grew in the specific richness of a child who has been consistently told that her curiosity is an asset. In the summer of 1883, Paul finished building the addition to the house that he had been planning for 2 years, a proper library, a room specifically for books, with built-in shelves on every wall and a window that caught the afternoon light and a comfortable chair and a footstool. He built the shelves himself over the course of 3 months, working in the evenings and on Sunday mornings, and when the room was done, he went and found Edith in the kitchen and said, "Come see." She followed him to the new room and stood in the doorway and looked at the empty shelves waiting and the afternoon light coming in the window and the chair positioned precisely to catch it, and she was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at him and her eyes were full, the way they had been in the new house the first December, that particular overflow of a person who has waited a long time for something and did not entirely believe it was coming. "You built me a library," she said. "I promised you bookshelves on every wall," Paul said. "I decided a whole room was more efficient." She came to him and took his face in both her hands and kissed him properly, with everything in it. And he held her there in the doorway of the new library in the summer afternoon. And outside the prairie went on in every direction, and the cottonwoods were full and green along the creek. And Thomas was somewhere in the fields with Cole Ferris learning about irrigation, and Clara was asleep in her crib in the cool of the back room, and the world was exactly as it should be. They spent that evening moving books from the overflowing shelves in the front room to the library, carrying them in armfuls, and arranging them with the collaborative attention of two people who have strong and compatible opinions about how books should be organized. Edith argued for subject, Paul argued for author within subject, and they reached a compromise that satisfied both of them. And then they stood back and looked at the filled shelves in the lamplight, and it was one of the better evenings of either of their lives. Paul stood in the doorway of his library on the 37 acres south of Caldwell, Kansas, and looked at the books his wife had spent years collecting and the room he had built for them, and the lamp burning on the small table and Edith sitting in the chair with Clara asleep across her lap, turning the pages of something with one hand, the other resting on the child. And he thought about a bay horse with one white stocking and a November morning in 1878, and a woman crossing a street looking at the sky as though she were reading it. He thought about 37 acres and a creek in the corner, and a woman who had said she was not a ship going down. He thought about coffee on a cold morning and biscuits, and soup in a sick room, and a hand taken on a porch in March, and everything that had come after. The planting and the building and the marrying and Thomas in small muddy boots and Clara's watchful eyes, and the slow, daily, extraordinary accumulation of a life shared with the right person. He thought about what the Reverend had said and what Mrs. Hargrove had said and what the town had agreed upon, that Edith Collins was past saving, that she had chosen her ruin, that there was nothing to be done for her. He thought about all of it, and he thought about Edith, who had not needed saving, who had never needed saving, who had needed exactly what she had, a person willing to sit beside her without an agenda, without a rescue planned, without a story about who she ought to be. He had not come to save her. He had come to stay beside her. And here he was. And it was, unequivocally and completely, the best thing he had ever done. Edith looked up from her book and found him in the doorway, and she gave him the full smile, the one that completed itself, the one that had started at the corner of her mouth on a November afternoon in the Silver Creek saloon, and had never stopped arriving since. And Paul smiled back with everything he had, and Clara stirred slightly and settled, and the lamp burned warm, and outside the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, and on 37 acres with a creek in the corner. Two people who had found each other were exactly where they were supposed to be. 3 more years on, and the land had grown in the way of tended things. Paul had negotiated the purchase of an additional 18 acres to the south, which put him at 55 acres total, enough to diversify properly, enough to build something that could support the family not just adequately, but well. He had a proper arrangement with a grain merchant in Wichita that gave him fair prices, and the farm had graduated from subsistence to genuine productivity. He hired 2 permanent hands, young men from a family that had come down from Nebraska, and paid them honest wages and treated them like people, which they were. And in return they worked with the commitment of people who have been treated fairly and know the difference. Edith had become, without particularly planning it, the person people came to when they needed to know something about plants or medicine or the education of children. She had started teaching the older children of neighboring homesteaders informal lessons 3 mornings a week, reading and arithmetic and natural history and geography, using her books and her particular gift for explanation, and her absolute refusal to speak down to a young mind. The nearest proper school was 6 miles away, and the roads were unreliable, and the parents of these children were grateful in the specific way of people who understand what their children are receiving. She wrote letters to a woman's education organization in St. Louis about the need for better schooling on the Kansas frontier, and received letters back, and the correspondence became an ongoing exchange that she valued greatly. She talked to Paul about it in the evenings, and he listened with his full attention and asked questions and offered thoughts. And she found that he was the best conversational partner she had ever had, not because he agreed with her. He did not always, but because he disagreed specifically and honestly, and from a genuine engagement with what she had said rather than a reflexive position. Thomas at 5 was already reading, not because he had been pushed to it, but because he had grown up in a house where reading was the most natural thing adults did, and had simply understood that this was a thing worth doing. He read haltingly but with determination and the specific frustration of a child who wants to go faster than current ability allows. Edith sat with him patiently at the kitchen table on winter evenings, and he read to her from simple books while Clara sat nearby looking at pictures and waiting for her turn, because Clara was 2 now, and had understood that her brother got to do something at that table that she did not yet get to do, and she found this arrangement insufficient. In the autumn of 1885, Paul came in from the East Field on a Friday afternoon with the particular expression of a man who has been sitting with something for a long time and has finally decided to say it. He sat at the kitchen table, and Edith looked at him and said, "What is it?" He told her about Dutch Hannigan, who had written from Wichita. Dutch was getting older and had been managing a small cattle operation for years that he was looking to sell or hand off, and he had written to Paul partly to stay in touch, and partly because he was thinking through what came next for him. But that was not the thing Paul was sitting with. The thing he was sitting with was what Dutch had mentioned in passing, that the town of Caldwell was beginning to build a proper schoolhouse and had been trying to find a teacher. Paul looked at Edith across the table and said, "I told you because it seems to me that this is something you might want to know about. The decision is yours entirely." Edith looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the window where the autumn afternoon was doing something golden and precise, and she was quiet with her thoughts, which Paul had learned to give her without filling. "A proper school," she said. "A proper school," Paul said, "with a proper teacher, which would require someone qualified and capable and who understood both the subject and the students." She looked at him. "That is a very particular description. I have a very particular person in mind." She was quiet again for a moment, and then she said, "I would need to be able to teach what I believe ought to be taught, not just reading and sums, history, natural science, literature." "I believe those would be your choices to make," Paul said. Another quiet. Then she said, "And the children here, the ones who come on mornings." "The schoolhouse is 6 miles, Paul said. "That means they could attend. That means the children who currently cannot get there could. That means your 3 mornings a week reaches everyone." Edith looked at him, and her expression was that particular open and unguarded one, the one that came when she was feeling something entirely true. "You thought all of this through," she said. "I have been thinking about it since Tuesday," Paul said, "which is when Dutch's letter arrived. You waited until Friday to tell me." "I wanted to have thought it through properly first," he said, "so I could be useful." She stood up from the table and came around to him and stood in front of him and put both hands on either side of his face the way she had in the doorway of the library 3 years before, and she looked at him with the full weight of everything she was. "Paul Watkins," she said, "you are the best thing that has ever happened to me." "That is a high standard," Paul said. "I intend to maintain it." She kissed him again, and outside the autumn afternoon was all gold and long shadow, and Thomas was somewhere near the barn talking to the horses in the particular earnest way he had, and Clara was asleep in the warm house, and the 55 acres were going into their winter rest, and everything was as it was and as it would be, built and tended and kept, the long work of a life shared honestly. Edith took the teaching position at Caldwell's new schoolhouse in the spring of 1886. She rode there 3 days a week on Clover, who at 14 was still sound and steady, and regarded the schoolhouse with the calm indifference of a horse who has seen everything. The children came from 6 families in a 10-mile radius, ranging in age from 5 to 14, and Edith taught all of them in the single room with the organized ferocity of someone who has thought a great deal about what young minds need and is not going to waste the opportunity. She taught reading with the books from her own shelves, not primers that spoke to children as though they were not yet people, but real texts, simplified where necessary but genuine. She taught the natural history of the Kansas prairie, with specimens from her own garden and observations from her own field work. She taught arithmetic with practical applications that made sense in the context of farms and measurements and money, so the children understood why any of it mattered. She taught history that included the full complexity of the American West, the cattle trade, and the indigenous peoples who had been here long before any of them and whose land this had been, the actual injustices of it, spoken plainly, because she believed that understanding the world as it actually was, and as it had actually been, was the beginning of being responsible in it. This last part generated some conversation in Caldwell, because some parents were uncomfortable and said so. Edith received 2 letters of complaint and had 2 conversations in the schoolroom after hours, and in both cases she listened carefully and said, with the complete and unfrightened directness that was her essential quality, that she would continue to teach children true things, because the alternative was to teach them false things, and she was not going to do that. One of the 2 families withdrew their child, which was their right. The other family, after 2 weeks of thinking about it, sent theirs back, because their son had come home and talked for an hour at dinner about things he had learned and had clearly been thinking, and they decided that this was worth the discomfort. Paul heard about the complaints from Cole Ferris, who had heard about it at the general store, and that evening he said to Edith, "I hear there was some dispute at the schoolhouse." "There was," Edith said. "How did you handle it?" "Directly," she said. He smiled. "Of course you did. Are you concerned?" she asked. "No," he said. "I am proud." She looked at him, and the softness that appeared in her eyes when he said things like that was one of the most private and precious things he knew about her, a tenderness she did not display publicly, something she kept for the people she trusted with her actual self. "You are very easy to love," she said. "I am trying to be," Paul said. She reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat in the evening kitchen of the house he had built on the 37 acres plus 18 that were his land on the Kansas frontier. And through the window the prairie evening was turning all its colors, the vast sky going from blue to orange to the particular deep violet that preceded the stars, and the lamp on the table made its steady warm light, and everything was closed, everything was resolved, everything was built and real and tended. Thomas grew to be a boy who loved the land with the same focus his father did, and who also read everything he could get his hands on, which pleased both his parents and was perhaps inevitable. Clara grew to be a girl whose watchfulness had developed into a precise and restless intelligence that Edith recognized with the particular warmth of recognizing yourself in your child, and resolving to give that child the space you had not always had. The 3rd child was a boy, born in the summer of 1887, and they named him James, and he was from the first week of his life the loudest person anyone had ever encountered, which Thomas found both impressive and trying. The house on the 55 acres was full and warm and operational, a home that worked in all the ways a home can work, with the wood stove and the bookshelves and the kitchen garden and the chickens and the horses in the paddock and the fields going on beyond. And in the evenings when the children were asleep, Paul and Edith sat together by the fire with their books or their conversation or their companionable silence. The specific quiet of two people who have learned each other completely and find that what they have learned is endlessly sufficient. She still rode out onto the prairie alone sometimes when she needed the scale of it, the enormous uninterrupted space, and the sky that went on forever. Paul understood this and never questioned it, because he had always understood that Edith's solitude was not a rejection but a necessity, as fundamental to who she was as her books and her garden and her sharp, honest tongue. She would come back from those rides with her hair wind-blown and her color high and her eyes clear, and she would take care of Clover and come inside and find him and stand close, and he would wrap an arm around her, and they would look at whatever the evening had to offer. And in those moments, every time, Paul Watkins was aware of the fullness of his life with a clarity that was not nostalgic but present, not about what had been but about what was, right now, in this house on this land beside this woman. He had come to Caldwell to plant a crop and had stayed to grow a life, and the life was more than anything he had imagined when he rode in on a cold November morning with a bay horse and 2 years of plans and the vague hope of belonging somewhere. He had not come to save her. He had said that clearly, that first evening in the diner on 2nd Street when she had told him plainly that she was not a ship going down, and he had meant it then, and he meant it still. She had not needed saving. She had needed someone willing to show up without an agenda, without a rescue, without the presumption that she was a problem whose solution was his to provide. She had needed someone willing to sit beside her, in the Silver Creek saloon and in her kitchen and on her porch and in the middle of her life. He had come to stay beside her, and in the long, full, ordinary, extraordinary years that followed, that was exactly what he did. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, eventually built a second schoolroom and hired a second teacher, which was partly a result of enrollment that had grown considerably, and partly the result of a campaign by Edith Collins Watkins that began with letters to the school board and ended with a meeting that Paul attended and said approximately nothing at while Edith said approximately everything necessary, and by the time they walked out the second classroom was funded. Mrs. Hargrove passed away in the fall of 1888, which Edith heard about from the librarian and acknowledged with a quiet and genuine. She was a difficult woman, and she lived a difficult life. That was all she said, and it was the most complete and honest obituary the woman received, though it was spoken to an audience of one in the warmth of a kitchen on a November morning. Dutch Hannigan came out to the farm for Christmas of 1889 and stayed for 2 weeks, during which he taught Thomas card tricks that Paul had to officially object to and unofficially admire, and he held the baby James with the careful terror of a man who has never quite got used to babies and is determined not to drop this one. And he sat on the porch with Paul on the clear, cold evenings and talked in the easy way of old friends. And on the last evening he said, "You did the right thing, Watkins. Coming here. Planting yourself." "I know it," Paul said. Dutch looked at the dark land and the stars. "Not many men find what you have found. Not many men look in the right place," Paul said. Dutch considered this. Where was the right place? Paul looked back through the lit window at the kitchen, where Edith was at the table with Thomas working through a mathematics problem, her dark hair pinned up, her hand tracing numbers on the slate, her voice clear and patient. Clara was asleep already and James was in his cradle and the fire was going and the bookshelves on every wall held what they held. "Here," Paul said. "It was here the whole time." Dutch Hannigan was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Well," and nothing more because there was nothing more to say. The years accumulated in the way of good years, not without difficulty. The drought summer of 1890 was hard, and a fence dispute with a new neighbor to the east required navigation, and there were seasons of illness and seasons of worry, as there always are in a life genuinely lived. But with the steady bedrock of two people who had decided to face things together, and had found that together was stronger than the sum of the parts. Thomas, at 11, was working the land beside his father on weekends with the seriousness of a boy who has decided his future and is beginning to build toward it. Clara, at 8, had started corresponding by letter with a botanical institute in St. Louis because she had written them a letter about a plant specimen she had found along the creek, and her mother had helped her send it, and they had written back, and the correspondence was the most important thing in her life next to her mother's books. James, at 3, was simply the most enthusiastic human being currently on the Kansas plains, and the household had organized itself around this fact with the resigned affection of a family that knows exactly who it is. Edith taught at the schoolhouse and tended her garden and read her books and rode clover on the wide prairie when she needed the sky, and she was 55 acres deep in a life that was entirely and specifically hers, not because it had been granted to her or because someone had rescued her into it, but because she had built it, deliberately and on her own terms, and Paul Watkins had come and built alongside her. And what they had made together was solid and true and lit from within by the particular warmth of genuine love. On a May morning in 1891, Paul woke before the rest of the house as he always did and went to stand on the porch in the early light. The prairie was enormous and green, recovering from the drought year, the grass coming back strong the way grass on the plains always does, stubborn and necessary. The creek ran clear, and the cottonwoods were in their spring leaf, and the fields were planted and the barn stood solid, and the house behind him was warm and full of the sleeping breath of his family, and the morning light was the particular clear gold of May on the Kansas frontier, and Paul Watkins stood in it and breathed and felt, as he felt every morning, the full and grounded weight of belonging somewhere. He heard the door behind him, and Edith came out with 2 cups of coffee, handing him one with the automatic accuracy of someone who has performed this particular ritual 10,000 times. She came and stood beside him, and they looked at the morning together, at the land they had planted and kept and expanded, at the creek and the cottonwoods and the distance that went on into the great blue ordinary sky, and she put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around hers. "Good morning," Edith said. "Good morning," Paul said. They stood together on the porch of the house he had built on the land he had bought in November of 1878, and the coffee was hot and the morning was beautiful and the children were asleep inside and everything was as it was and would be, and there was not one single thing missing from the world as it currently existed on those 55 acres south of Caldwell, Kansas. He had not come to save her. He had come to stay beside her, and he had, and he would. And they were, unequivocally and completely and without reservation, home.